Hey guys, Blake here. This footage was taken from my friend Paul the Avon's live stream. This is an interview with Robert Patman from Otago University, who is a professor in international relations. So we'll take you to that interview right now.
Brilliant. Right. Joining me in the studio at the moment, I've got Blake Forbes and Professor Robert Patman. A random
Well,
question for you, Professor. I realize Otago University is going through a name change at the moment. So is it still from Otago University or is the new name
Yes,
kicked in?
still at Otago University, but it's going through a branding exercise. It's changed um, some of its traditional symbols and updated them. So yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a significant change for the university, but it seems to be going quite well. So
So
institutions do these things.
they do. They absolutely do. You are a internationally renowned expert on international relationships and how the
Thank you.
world works, really. So it's a great honor to have you here. Blake's worked
Thank
really
you.
hard to get you on as well. So thank you very much for this, Blake. It's very much appreciated.
yeah, I'm happy to make those connections for you, Paul, and first of many, I hope. Um,
Absolutely.
would
Well,
you
thank
like
you,
me to
Blake.
start, or would you like to
Yeah.
start?
No, you can jump in with the first question, Blake.
So, let's start with Orcus. So, Mr. Peters has been very, let's say, uh, open about his thoughts around all of this. What's the perspective like for you to begin with?
Sorry, he's been very open about his thoughts. I didn't quite catch the last part of the question.
What's it like for you? How do you feel?
I'm not sure he has been particularly open um, about. He said that no commitment's been made and the government is actively exploring it. But he's also his government has made a number of statements which has changed our relationship to exploring AUKUS. You may recall that the previous government, we now know, was behind behind the scenes exploring the possibility of joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS. This Pillar 2, by the way, is simply, I say simply, it's a part of the enhanced security arrangement called AUKUS, which deals with sharing of cutting edge defense technology. Pillar 1 involves the transfer of nuclear power submarines over a very long time frame and at great expense between UK and the US on the one hand and Australia on the other.
Right.
So when we come back, so this question has been explored since 2021. The Labour government started the process, and the national government say under Mr Peters they're simply continuing it, but um, that is disputable. Um, first of all, the Labour government never said that AUKUS is good for regional security. Secondly, um, this government has linked possible membership of AUKUS 2, with Pillar 2 of AUKUS, with what they call ever closer relations with the United States. In other words, it's been a central goal of this government to achieve closer alignment with traditional allies. And AUKUS now seems to be, if you like, a key component of that process. So there's a linkage there that didn't exist before. So it's not quite the hands-off investigation that I think Labour, and it's fair to say there were divisions within the Labour government. Andrew Little seemed to be much keener on Pillar 2 than, say, Nanaia Mahuta, the foreign minister, who was distinctly cool about the idea of joining Pillar 2. So how open has the government been? Well, it's been open that there's been no commitment yet, which is welcome. But on the other hand, they've also been quite forward leaning without actually acknowledging they are forward leaning about it. So I think it's a qualified openness, if you see what I mean.
Yes,
For
and
me,
what sorry, and what I
I was
would
going to
say,
say that
yeah,
for me, when
sorry.
it comes to AUKUS, the big fear, and to be fair, I'm not a huge expert on this topic. If we're having closer relationships in a military way with America, what does that mean for our nuclear-free status?
Well, that's the big complication. Many of us, I'm an AUKUS skeptic. First of all, it will, I don't doubt the sincerity of this government or the previous government in saying that membership of Pillar 2 would not compromise their commitment to non-nuclear security. But the problem is, Paul, New Zealand can't control the perceptions of countries that matter to us greatly, such as in the Pacific Island states and in ASEAN. Now, both the ASEAN, the 10 members of ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, and the Pacific Island states, both of them are bound by treaties which rule out nuclear weapons in their regions. And there's New Zealand. We've been championing non-nuclear security on a global basis, and suddenly we may become an associate member of an enhanced security arrangement which transfers nuclear power submarines to Australia. So the danger is, whatever we say about our role, others will see that we're backtracking on our commitment to non-nuclear security by being involved in an arrangement which is actually transferring nuclear-powered submarines to New Zealand's only ally, which is Australia. So that's a significant development. The other thing I'd like to add, Paul, at the moment, one thing that puzzles me is that we now know that both Labour and National have been seeking to find out what Pillar 2 involves for about 3 years. And
Shouldn't
that
take
tells
that
us
long, should
the
it?
fact they haven't discovered yet what's involved is slightly troubling. The other thing here is actually whether AUKUS is a good fit for New Zealand. I mean, I'm talking about Pillar 2. It does not depend on the discussions between the national government and other members of AUKUS. At the moment, everybody's waiting with bated breath to discover what Pillar 2 consists of. But actually, we can make up our minds about whether Pillar 2 would be a good fit for us, irrespective of what we discover it consists of. Why? Because strategy is about ends, not means. So at the moment, we're fixating on the means. But in fact, we know what the ends are. In September 21, when AUKUS was formed, we were told that it was the three English-speaking countries, had come together to try to bolster what was called the International Rules-Based Order in the Indo-Pacific. And although it wasn't made explicit, it was quite clear the biggest threat to that rules-based order was seen as the Chinese. So this is a security pact designed to deter China. So when we talk about Pillar 2, we must take into account whatever they discover in Pillar 2, our government, that will have to be reconciled with the fact that those capabilities will be used to contain or deter China.
Who is our
And
second biggest trading partner?
China is our biggest trading partner, yes.
So
So
we're
I
protecting
think at the
ourselves
moment
against
there was a
getting
poll
more money.
yesterday, and 52% of Kiwis polled, it was a One News poll, said that they were 52% when polled said they were comfortable with New Zealand joining Pillar 2, at least in principle. But A, we don't know what Pillar 2 consists of, and B, that's not really the crucial question. The crucial question should be, are you comfortable with joining Pillar 2 given those capabilities will be used to deter China or contain China? So, as a great Prussian strategist once said, that was Karl von Clausewitz, there's got to be good strategy is all about relating means to ends. And we've got to keep our eye on the ends of AUKUS. on the objectives of AUKUS. What's it designed to do? And that's where we should make up our mind.
So what I would like to ask is, so the Labour sources have told me that they wouldn't have gone as far as the current administration is in terms of AUKUS. So if and they are concerned that this could even lead to a Pillar 1 thing eventually. So how concerned are you that that might be turned out to be true?
I think this neat distinction between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as we've already sort of touched on in response to Paul's question, it exists, but I'm not sure how outside parties will interpret it. It's not so. I mean, let's be quite clear. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are united by the goal of deterring China. One involves nuclear weapons or nuclear powered submarines, and the other involves defense sharing or sharing high-tech defense technology, state-of-the-art, artificial intelligence. So when you look at it in that way, the distinction between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 begins to pale somewhat. And what we do know is that AUKUS as a whole is dedicated to deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. The problem is that if we are seeking to protect the rules-based order from China, it's incumbent on all parties concerned to make sure they protect the rules-based order internationally elsewhere in the world. And unfortunately, as we've seen in Gaza, that hasn't happened. So are we simply joining what is an American attempt to contain China?
Yeah, because the concern for me is they will start with Pillar 2, get let's say cozy with the Biden or Trump administration, whatever one wins in November, and then eventually transition into number 1.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I'm pleased you've raised the point about the volatility of US politics. I think it's fair to say I was in Australia last year in September. One of the things that surprised me is how skeptical many Australians are about AUKUS, not least because of the cost. But they also are fearful about Trump coming to power. And so I think it's fair to say that many Kiwis and indeed many Australians might be quite relaxed if Biden was president about Pillar 2, but they may be extremely agitated if an America First president was heading AUKUS. We've already seen with respect to NATO, Mr. Trump is not above demanding that people step up their defense contributions. That could put us in a difficult position. But the other thing is, we don't share the same values as Mr. Trump. National or Labour are both at odds with Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's view of the world is a free-for-all where great powers can exercise their power unencumbered by international institutions and multilateralism. Mr. Trump is an opponent of multilateralism, which is a keystone of New Zealand's foreign policy. So I can't see I can't even see AUKUS surviving if Mr. Trump comes to power. And so I know the government hasn't made a decision, which is good, but we need to be very clear about what the objectives of AUKUS are. Then there's another issue. I don't think we should have any illusions about China. It's a dictatorship. We've known that for a long time. But is AUKUS the appropriate vehicle for trying to counter Chinese influence? 3 English-speaking countries, one of whom, Britain, has serious baggage in the Indo-Pacific for its colonial past, taking it upon themselves to protect the whole region, that's 60% of the world's population, from the threat of China. There's 40 countries. Those countries don't see themselves as pawns in some strategic game between Washington and China. Yes, they're very worried about China, but they don't necessarily believe that 3 English-speaking countries are going to solve the problem for them.
In terms of unilateral sort of work that our government does with America and England. I'm guessing Ukraine is probably on that list as well. Our sort of addition to their fight against what's happening from Russia. How do you see that changing under this current government? Is that stance likely to change, or is that likely to be affected if Trump gets in?
Well, let's be quite clear. Mr. Trump has gone on record as saying that he would deliver peace within 24 hours in Ukraine if he became president. And when you decode that, that means he will ask the Ukrainians to surrender to an illegal invasion. And he did say that they wouldn't get a penny more once he was president. So Mr. Trump has a different view of the world. We're a liberal democracy. America is a liberal democracy. But Mr. Trump's supporters did try to overthrow the outcome of the 2020 election. So we have an insurrectionist, effectively, running for office in 2024. Yes, there's grave concern. Even when Mr. Trump's been out of power, the Biden administration has struggled to deliver some of its military assistance to Ukraine. I'm pleased you raised Ukraine because I think Orcus is a strategic sideshow. I don't think it's important to us, but Ukraine is. Why? Because if Mr. Putin is defeated by the West rallying behind Ukraine and Russian troops are ejected from their illegal invasion of another country, and let's be quite clear, Mr. Putin can end this conflict in 24 hours by taking his forces back to the internationally recognized borders of Russia. So that's one thing. But, you know, if we succeed in thwarting the Russian invasion, that will send a big message to Beijing or China, which is backing Mr. Putin. It's very important that any concession made to Putin in Ukraine by Mr. Trump will only embolden China, particularly with respect to Taiwan. So I'm pleased the national government has stepped up military support for Ukraine. We've given, I think, an extra 29 million, which brings our support now in humanitarian and military terms to over 100 million. That still pales in significance, by the way, with the sort of support that Australia and Canada are giving to the Ukraine. I do think New Zealand has a huge stake in the defeat of Putin. The world will be a much more dangerous place for us. We trade with about 100 countries. We depend on rules to do business. And if those rules are compromised by the demonstration of might is right from the Kremlin, then that could destabilize the world in which we try to make our living.
Yes, and with that, do you think that the national government is? Are you happy with the amount of support they are giving, or would you?
No,
like
I'd like to see a lot more. We have in our military arsenal, we have things like javelins and other military capabilities that could be used, which we're not using. I do think this is the number one strategic issue. It's a long way from us, but we will be affected by the outcome. And, you know, it's, as I say, I think the best strategy for trying to curb Chinese assertiveness is to defeat Putin. And that will register. I think AUKUS plays into China's hands. So, to me, the strategic priority is to try to liberate a country which is a liberal democracy and a non-nuclear power. Like New Zealand, it gave up nuclear weapons. A third factor linking New Zealand and Ukraine is that Mr. Seninsky said after the defeat of Russia, he will be leading the charge internationally to reform the Security Council, which has been a long-term goal of New Zealand governments going back to Peter Fraser.
Do you believe that Mr. Luxon needs to extend an invitation to Mr. Seninsky to come to New Zealand?
Yes, or Mr. Luxon can go and visit Mr. Seninsky in Ukraine. I do think it's important that we not only, to be fair, I was recently in a discussion with other speakers, with the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia and New Zealand, and he's fully aware that New Zealand and Kiwis fully support Ukraine. So he knows that. It's just that they're in a for 6 months, American military aid was not forthcoming. And so at the moment, they're trying to, that aid now is on its way, but they're dealing with a very difficult situation. I think this is a challenge that we're facing, that we must respond. I don't want to overhype this, but I think we could do a little bit more than we're doing. And we have a big interest in a Ukrainian victory. And so I do think we should do everything we can within the limits in which we find ourselves.
Is it one of those conflicts that it's been going on for a couple of years now,
Yeah.
and it's starting to get overshadowed by what we're seeing in the Middle East? Is there a risk of us as a public losing sight of what's actually going on there?
Yes, I think there's a tendency in New Zealand, even before Gaza, to say it's a long way from where we are. And, what impact does it have? Well, first of all, it has enormous impact in the region, which is our backyard, which is the Indo-Pacific. China, a key player and our biggest trading partner, is a big supporter of the Putin regime. It says it's neutral, but in fact, it's assisting, it's buying Russian oil, and it's providing technological support. And, as I come back to my point, if we want to see China less assertive, we need to make sure that Mr. Putin's illegal invasion of another country, this is basically a land grab, and it's got to be stopped. For middle powers and small powers, which don't have the muscle to throw their weight about internationally, rules matter. Rules are there for the weak, not the strong. We must make sure those rules are protected, and one way protecting international rules is to defeat Putin, who is seeking to break them. And by the way, if he succeeds in annexing Ukraine, there's no guarantee his expansionism will stop there.
Mm-hmm.
The final topic that we're going to finish with is the conflict in Gaza. So, are you happy with what's happening over there with Mr. Netanyahu and the conflict there?
No, I'm not happy. I think it's an international disgrace, the outcome. I mean, I was very concerned as early as the evening of the 7th of October after the dreadful Hamas terrorist attack, when the Israeli government announced that we'd be pursuing a policy of mighty vengeance. The problem that really worried me was that America responded to the situation by declaring unconditional support for a government, Netanyahu government, which has always ruled out the prospect of a Palestinian state. And until recently, the Netanyahu government had regarded Hamas as an asset, until 2019, actually, and had encouraged Qatar to funnel funds to Hamas. Why did Mr. Netanyahu regard Hamas as an asset? Because Hamas were at loggerheads with the Palestinian Authority, keeping the Palestinians divide and rule. And so Mr. Netanyahu, since the late 90s, has been a major opponent of a Palestinian state. I think what's happened has been truly dreadful. The UN Security Council has been sidelined. Let's be quite clear about this. The UN Security Council was established to maintain peace and security in the world. It hasn't been able to perform that function because the United States has exercised the veto at least 3 times to prevent a lasting ceasefire. Instead, it has tried through its back channels through its own diplomacy, working with Qatar, Egypt, and Israel and Hamas to bring about a ceasefire that way. But so far, there's been no relief for long-suffering people. And the thing that really concerns me is the world has largely watched this tragedy unfold over 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And 14,000 children have been killed, who by definition had nothing to do with the Hamas attack on the 7th of October. So the reason I'm very unhappy about this is because it's all very well the Biden administration talking about its support for a rules-based international order, but that remains just talk if you don't actually uphold humanitarian law and the laws of war. We've seen war crimes in Gaza during the last 6 months. We saw a war crime when Hamas attacked Israel, and unfortunately, the disproportionate and massive response of Israel, which has been supported by the United States, has also consisted of war crimes. So we're in a situation now where there is signs within the United States that many young people in particular are expressing their frustration and demanding an immediate end to the war. It's like parallels with the Vietnam War in the late 60s. But this is a very serious situation. I would go as far to say that what we've witnessed in the last 6 months is a crisis of humanity. That the fact that one power can block the majority, let's be quite clear. On the 12th of December last year, excuse me, 160 countries in the UN General Assembly, including New Zealand, had voted for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. But just a few days earlier, the US had vetoed such a proposal in the UN Security Council. The problem is that the General Assembly, its resolutions are non-binding, whereas the resolutions of the Security Council are binding. But I think we've spoken about Orcus, we've spoken about Ukraine this morning. There's linkage between these issues, and the linkage between Gaza and Orcus is that if we're forming a security arrangement like Orcus to uphold the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific, that is contradicted or undermined by the failure to uphold the rule of law in places like Gaza. And let's be quite clear, Israel, the IDF, I haven't heard the Israeli government apologize at any time for the civilian casualties. They talk about unfortunate collateral damage. I haven't heard anything that indicates there's going to be a real effort to protect civilians in this situation. And you know what? This is not good strategy. 6 months down the track, is Israel more secure after pulverizing Gaza, destroying 50% of residential buildings, leaving only one hospital intact at Rafah, and we're now led to believe there's going to be an attack on Rafah shortly. 1 million people displaced from their homes. Is this, and close to 34,000, according to the UN, Palestinians have died. Just imagine how you would feel if you were Palestinian, and many Palestinians intensely dislike Hamas. Just imagine how you would feel if a member of your family was killed in Mr Netanyahu's response to the Hamas attack when that member of the family had nothing to do with Hamas. They were killed. That would simply, if you like, set the scene for a further cycle of tit-for-tat violence in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, unfortunately, I said on the 9th of October, 2 days after the event, in a local newspaper here, the ODT, there is no military solution available. It's a political problem. And the problem is this. This is what's got to be addressed. The Palestinians' desire and aspirations for a state have to be reconciled with Israel's desire for greater security. And that's the political challenge. But you can't solve that challenge by simply using military power to crush those who resist you. And that is something we have to face up to.
How do you rate the New Zealand response to what's happening over there?
Mixed. Diplomatically, we've done some good things. On the 27th of October, without any fanfare, we became the only member of the Five Eyes to vote for an immediate humanitarian truce. So it was only Ireland and New Zealand amongst the so-called Western countries that actually took that step. And then we co-sponsored the resolution in the General Assembly on the 12th of December. But we haven't been very vocal. I'm disappointed that the outgoing Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, and the incoming Prime Minister, Chris Luxon, didn't get together and issue a joint statement. After all, we're told we've got a bipartisan foreign policy. They could have made New Zealand's position absolutely crystal clear. And I'm pleased that Mr. Peters is now talking much more firmly. He made a good speech in February in the General Assembly. I think it was in February. It was quite recent anyway, about the situation in Gaza. I think it was March, actually. And it was a hard-hitting speech. He said the situation in Gaza, there must be an immediate ceasefire, lasting ceasefire. And he also indicated that the Israeli military campaign would not generate greater security for their country. He also spoke about an issue which is very deep, it doesn't get much coverage in the Western world, but is important, which is the Israeli illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. And he said that is a recipe for continuing insecurity, and he called for it to stop. And I think it was a good, hard-hitting speech, but it came 5 months into the conflict rather than at the beginning. And I think that come back to your question, I think our performance has been mixed. I think many other countries expected New Zealand, having demonstrated courage over non-nuclear security in the mid-80s, and having demonstrated courage in opposing the US invasion, illegal US invasion of Iraq. Ellen Clark said no.
Yes.
I think they expected us to speak up forcefully, adding our voice much more forcefully, calling for a ceasefire.
I think we've had your time absolutely run out, and I am absolutely enthralled by this, but we have to let you get back to teaching and doing all the other stuff that professors do these days.
That's right.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Very welcome.
Very much appreciate it. I've learned so much. It's brilliant. It's like being back at university. I have actually been taking notes while we've been going as well. So it's just like being back at university. So thank you very much for your time, Professor.
You're very welcome. No, thank you guys for hosting me. I appreciate it.